No one's face should be that big. Thank you for all being here, and I would like to thank everyone that's made this weekend possible, but it would take literally all my time. So maybe I'll focus on just like the people that had to deal with me primarily. Novica, thank you. Tamara, Ivana, where you are, and the sponsors, etc. So thank you very much for being here. Am I too close to the mic? Is that okay? It's okay. No, it's okay. Okay. So let's just begin. Yeah, let's just start this whole thing. So the prompts we were given were behind the mask, and then I think everyone then was given a subtopic, and our subtopic was. Is that better, you think? Okay, is that better? So we were given this sort of, say, primary topic of behind the mask, and then a subtopic of urbanism. And they asked for micro-urbanism, but I kind of ignored the micro aspect of it because I don't really understand. I don't adhere to this kind of linear concept of scale, so I'm going to ignore that. So I thought, how could I sort of integrate this idea of behind the mask in this prompt? So I thought about something we do in our work is always about delaminating the real, how you pull back what we cannot see, maybe, which is essentially behind the mask, and how we can then sort of look at behind the mask of urbanism. So it's interesting. So urbanism has a quite clear definition, right? It sort of begins in 1859 with Serda's idea, and then there's a really clear definition which obviously we all know. The term urbanism originated in the 19th century. It's about creating an autonomous activity focused on the spatial organization of the city. And you know something's clear when you Google it and all the images kind of look the same, right? So it seems like we know what urbanism is, but what's more interesting is kind of looking at its sort of root word, right? And I think we all think we know what urban means, but if you actually sat down and tried to define it, you probably couldn't. And it's like there's a seminal Supreme Court case in the United States in 1964, and it dealt with pornography. And Justin Potter wrote in the opinion for the court that I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. Right? I think we think that about urban as well. We think we know what urban is. We think we know what cities are. So I want to interrogate sort of two misconceptions about the idea of urban or city. The first is definition. There's varying standards for the term urban. In 2006, the UN attempted to create a definition of urban, because that was the year supposedly 50% of the world then now lives in cities, et cetera, et cetera. So they had to do this document, and there's 106 legal definitions of the term urban, right? And if you sort of just take them at random, so in America, it's 2,500 people or more. So Boca Raton is considered urban. In Canada, it's a place of 1,000 more inhabitants having a population density of 400. So this is considered urban. In Japan, we think of Tokyo, we think of Kyoto, it's really clear cities, but actually this would also be considered urban. There's my favorite definition. What's going on here? Iceland, 200 more people, that we had 200 people here yesterday. That would be considered urban. So something like this is considered legally urban by the UN fact book, right? And I think none of us would ever look at this and say, oh, that has these urban qualities. The best definition I found was, Indonesia, a place with urban characteristics. I mean, that's like a negating sentence. You can't use a word to define itself. So I thought that was amazing, so this would be considered urban. The next misconception about urban deals with the idea of the city versus the rural. And in the 2006, all these terrible architecture firms and these unqualified people started going around talking about 50% of the world lives in cities and mega cities, et cetera, et cetera. It's always the same three-letter firms, right? So this misconception of city rural is simply not true. So, so there's these, I'm sorry, I can't, this remote's not great. Okay, that's the wrong way. So this is an image used by OMA in 2010, trying to talk about globalization and stuff, and they make this, I'm really sorry, what's going on? This image, so mega city regions, and this is where a majority of the world lives, in these mega city regions. And then everyone saw this diagram about massive urbanization in 1960, but this is simply not true. It is, you saw the definitions. How do we say that something that has 100 people is the same thing as New York City? But the primary function of this was to create a misconception about inside and outside and where sort of global capital can move. So the idea, this is completely, like, it's immoral to sort of make these arguments without any sort of academic or sort of, say, legitimization. So this is we call the 50% myth, that geographers and sociologists known about this a long time. If you just Googled it, you would learn this. So a really important academic. He's the most cited academic in the world, and is a good friend of ours, and he's a seminal figure. He's a political geographer, was at the GSD for a while, and he's now at the University of Chicago, and he wrote this seminal book about implosion, explosion towards a planetary urbanization. And to summarize what his sort of treatise is, and it was profound, is that there's no such thing as an inside or outside. So to summarize the book, there's four principles. One, the disappearance of the wild zones, the global interconnectedness of territories, the blurred division between town and country, and the globalization of urban inequalities. So this is really a political device, and you can look at the United States as a great example of this. You create this sort of other, right? You said the urban is like doing yoga and driving hybrids and embracing neoliberal policies. And then the rural is voting for Trump and they hate people like me. And it sort of, this division legitimizes this misconception that there's an other. And so, for example, I want to show you this project by this brilliant artist where she traced, so there's a finite amount of sand in the world that we can actually use for concrete. I think it's the second most scarce resource after water, is sand, because it has to be coarse, it can't be smooth, so we can't use desert sand for this sort of construction. So most of the sand is coming from just a few sort of places. And so this example how Singapore is moving sand from Vietnam, bringing it to these containers, shipping it across the sea, and then sort of reconstructing its own country. So it's literally creating land. So 25% of Singapore's land is reclaimed, and a lot of that reclamation is from Vietnam. And so this is kind of this idea of planetary urbanization. If you have literal soil, and I think soil and I think geology should have agency. I think what Chile tried to do last month with their new constitution, that the ecology deserves the same inalienable rights as a human being. Right? So if we're just extracting sand, bringing it, building a country, and then calling that definition of a country sort of autonomous, I think that's completely false. So this kind of sort of interrogation of our building materials. As architects, we simply just can't use concrete. We have to understand the material sort of reality of that concrete and where it's coming from. So the other thing is that there's a direct correlation between urbanization and capitalism. Essentially, urbanism is a tool for the distribution, the physical manifestation of capitalism. It's just simply true. So these are the tenets, right, of capitalism. If you reduce them to the core ideological things that have to happen. One, it requires constant expansion, an ever-increasing level of industrial production and consumption, and growth is the directive of capitalism. So, for example, if Facebook makes $6 billion in 2018, and then it makes $2 billion, it's considered a loss. It's considered a failure. Because it has to grow. It has to become bigger and bigger. And it's simply not natural to always want to grow. So, but also, if you look at these terms, you could also be describing urbanization. It requires constant expansion, increasing levels of industrial production and consumption. Growth is a primary directive of capitalism, but it's also the primary desire of our own profession. We build, we make, and we want to expand. So architecture, urbanism is simply a tool. We are a tool for capitalism, for the market economy, for these sort of really horrible things that happen throughout the world. We are complicit and we've done it. So, all these sort of misconceptions, so we think urbanization is like this, but really, most urbanization has not addressed specific human needs or has led to any impactful social changes. So this is a part of Indonesia. And then one other thing that's happened, there's a direct correlation with urbanization and inequality, right, in terms of income disparity, et cetera, et cetera. This is Piketty, the French economist, who talks about this sort of return of labor versus return of capital. And this trajectory where we begin to see this sort of greater difference between the two is actually correlates with sort of the urbanization of the world, right? So you see urbanization is promoting and leading sort of this leading to inequality. So constant growth is not natural. There's no organic example of any organism that exists in a constant state of expansion. There's actually a genetic disorder called Marfan syndrome, where a human being is growing constantly. They don't usually live past 18 years old, right? And so it's like a genetic anomaly as an economic principle. Like nothing, it stabilizes it. So again, something like this is not natural. Right, and it's not. It's just it's investments. It's completely decontextualized. It's completely immaterial to its real. It could be anywhere. If I didn't put Moscow there, and maybe I didn't, you wouldn't know where that was. It could be Shanghai. It could be Dubai. It could be Istanbul. Who knows? And it's the same 5 fucking firms, doing this crap. And then again, another thing we're doing is a direct correlation to this. So now we're killing human beings. We're driving inequality. We're leading to globalization and colonization at both a market-based level and, let's say, a cultural level. But we're also literally destroying the world, right? There's a direct correlation with urbanization. So 1850 is really kind of considered the birth of capitalism in London. So. And you see, as we begin to urbanize, we also begin to destroy the earth. We're not going to save the earth. We have to stop that. All we can try to do is mitigate the damage. Like, we're not okay. I'm sorry, this is not very uplifting. Maybe it will later. But so I think we have to understand what we've done. And I'm guilty in this. I've worked at these firms that I'm criticizing now. So again, we know these things from the Paris Accord, and then, of course, architects try to exploit crises, and they're going to develop these massive plans that are going to save the world, and they're all rubbish, because all of them also demand growth. No one's going to say, well, we don't need to grow. Like, no, we can grow sustainably. No, you can't. You simply cannot. So growth has a totalitarian logic. Every industry, every sector, every national economy must grow all the time with no identifiable end. And even the Green New Deal, which is, championed by liberals and not really the leftists, but is this great thing that will save the world, is not going to. Because it still, again, requires growth, and it requires lithium, and it requires cobalt, nickel. And this is the lithium. So lithium batteries, if you don't know, are primarily made from cobalt, nickel, and lithium. 65% of the world's lithium comes from the lithium triangle, which is Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. And then nickel and cobalt primarily come from Africa. So they're extracting these territories, bringing these sort of materials to China or the United States, fabricating these lithium-ion batteries. So the carbon footprint of an electrical energy is terrible, right? As the way we're doing it now is to forget about the exploitation of labor. So, and what's funny is that now electric cars are cool, and they transcend every ideology, from your neoliberals in San Francisco to your hardcore Trump supporters. Hummer has, I don't know if you guys know the Hummer, but this was the douchiest car in the early 2000s. Only bros drove it. And then, they're using provocative sort of images. But the truth is, lithium looks like this. This is the actual mining facilities for cobalt. It looks like this. And in the Green New Deal, they try to put a provision in there saying all lithium has to be mined from fair wages, fair labor, and liberals actually took it out. Because if we actually mined lithium in a humane way, it would become impossible to pay for based on a market economy's desire to constantly expand and grow. So even the best intentions by good people don't work. So again, I think this is completely wrong. I think as right now, our profession needs to stop and just sort of reevaluate and think. This Nike just do it. No, I think we just need to stop a little bit. And I think we have to ask ourselves this fundamental question: what is architecture? Like urban, we never ask ourselves what is urban. We never ask ourselves what is this, but have you ever truly asked yourself what is architecture? And if anyone can answer that quickly, ignore them, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with Hegel, but he's a really important sort of figure in Western thought, because prior to Hegel, people try to make these sort of rules about the concept of freedom. So Adam Smith has the harm principle. That's Mill. Kant has the categorical imperative, et cetera, et cetera. But Hegel comes along and changes Western philosophy and theory. There is no Marx, there is no Freud, there is no Nietzsche, then there is no theory without Hegel, unfortunately. But he says freedom is not a law. It's not this abstract concept. It's the very thing in which a human being has to overcome to become a human being. And every generation, every civilization has to define that obstacle for themselves. So United States, during the Jim Crow laws, which still exist, the Black American voting was that obstacle to enable freedom. I would say in the United States right now, it's debt for students. That's an obstacle that's going to prohibit level of freedom. So if every generation has to define freedom for themselves, I think every generation has to we have to redefine architecture. We have to understand its response to our material and immaterial needs, so the ecology, the environment, inequality, diversity. This is how we need to address it. It's not four walls and a roof. It's simply too easy to sort of take us like, oh, that's not within your brief, because that's within your brief as a human being, and you're a human being before you're an architect. So, and I love this quote, all that exists deserves to perish, so I think we should kill architecture. So I think we should, this is something I wrote during the pandemic, and I'll just read it to you. I quote myself, it's not arrogant, I just don't want to plagiarize myself. Architectural education still reifies architecture and assigns it an ontological and explanatory status. I believe such a reification is a fallacy, and that we would be better served by recognizing that there's no such ontological thing as architecture. I suggest we examine how the ideology of architecture functions within the systems of production and reproduction in the contemporary built and unbuilt and destroyed environments. We are as responsible for the built as we are the destroyed. By accepting that there's no such thing as architecture, it will enable us to better theorize on the workings of power in the systems of social production. So I think we should agree today that there's no such thing as architecture, and our responsibility going forward is to redefine it to address the crises that we've caused by simply being a tool for capital. So with that, I'd like to begin my lecture, which is called Productive Nothingness. So I kind of showed you my footnotes, because I think it's important to sort of take the mask off and show you the theory behind the work. So I use the term nothingness not in this sort of Western idea, which means, like, say, nothing, but in Eastern thought, and specifically in, say, Eastern philosophy in India and Japan, there's a term called sunyata, and it means radical impermanence, or a continuous state of exfoliation. And so nothing is something. You remember, I'm Indian, and we are the ones that came up with the concept of zero. And that's radical to me. Nothing is something. The idea of a zero existing delegitimizes even like Cartesian logic. It delegitimizes like everything sort of that happened in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which is completely problematic. I mean, we don't die from a toothache now. That's good about the Renaissance. It's problematic. So we use this concept territory, and actually my friend here, she's going to talk about this as well, and we both maybe have been influenced by similar people. But we're using this concept of territory as how, as a practice and as an academic, I want to rephrase or reapproach the work of architecture. And so I'm using a lot of the cultural geographers. I'll go through this quickly. Where am I on time? 10 minutes left? Oh, wow, okay. Territories are brought into being through extensive networks involving international accounting standards, models, maps, materials, and digital infrastructure. So he's talking about like the service, the things, the invisible, the things behind the mask. And here the mask is urbanization. Here the mask is architecture. So we pull that mask off. What are the ideological sort of things? So for Marx, like, ideology was a thing in which people cannot see. It's the social and sort of cultural and the economical sort of rules that make a society so. So what's the ideology behind the mask? And territory tries to look at this. And this is really, I could recommend Anssi Passi, as a Finnish geographer, wrote, the overall understanding of the territory is an understanding of these pieces and how they define the power relations and the social construction of the area in question. So I think we have to look more at social sciences and cultural geographers to understand space and place. Those are two different things, right? Space is like a mathematical term. It's physical, but place is personal. So architects, we cannot create place. We can create space, and then place was up to that human being. So if this lecture goes poorly, I'm going to think this is a shitty room. But the young firms that spoke yesterday, it was a great lecture, so they think this room's great. So that's place. But we're both in the same space. So I think this understanding between space and place, and so this is sort of his treatise. I think this is almost like an architectural brief. Not a brief, but let's say like the things we had to address when operating in the built, unbuilt environment is territory shape, which are there's like the physical, there's symbolic shape, which are like an identity, institutional shape, which would be like what they maybe Foucault would call the ideology networks, and identity. And so using that, kind of developed this sort of very linear structuralist diagram for me to understand how we might operate. And obviously it's sort of like this terrible algorithm that still works in this sort of Cartesian way, but it's just a simple for me to sort of look at the layers. And what I like about this, it shows how insignificant architecture is, right? It's so removed from what matters or what happens. So until we realize how insignificant architecture is, I think we then can make it significant, because we, especially the younger generation, you have to determine what architecture is, because we've ruined it. We destroyed it. So the younger generation has the responsibility to us and redefine architecture for what you need it to be, or we need it to be. This process, I kind of refer to it as architecture as territory and the material and immaterial contour. So material would be like the physical world. Immaterial would be like ideology or the culture, language, etc. So the next is like, I wanted to also demonstrate the methodology of this theory, right? So it's like how you test theory through a method. So we use critical geography as the base of our sort of approach. And critical geography, I think, if you know what it is, I think this is really important. So geography was really constructed in the West, primarily as a tool of destruction and militarization. It was used as a way to colonize and divide and conquer. It's a pseudoscience, yet it becomes real. So, but critical, and what the primary function of, let's say, cartography in its sort of neoclassical sense is to create borders. A line as a destruction, a line as a violent act. That drawing that line is an act of violence. So, can this play? Oh, I really wanted to watch that. So this is two dogs that are barking sort of incredibly at each other when the gate is up. But when you remove the gate, there's no barking. They actually get along. It's only the presence of this, say, line or this border or this wall that creates this tension. And this is what boundaries do. This is what identity does, the different shapes of territory does. So maps do not tell the truth, they create the truth. And I think this is also, architecture is a form of map making. And I think it's still rooted in like an 18th century Western Anglo-Saxon understanding of it. So I think that's deeply problematic. So again, geopower, classical geography doesn't argue, it just is, versus geography is not a natural given, but a power-knowledge relationship. I think my students, I always ask them to zoom out. Even if they're doing a tiny parcel, you have to understand how it's part of a larger network and everything is connected. And that we can't like separate ourselves from everything else by saying the client didn't ask me to do that. That's simply not okay. So beyond political realism, beyond the wise man, beyond the absence of power. The critical question is like how global space is visualized and imagined, how territorial space is produced and managed, and who's doing all these things, where, when, and with what effect. So that's really sort of a key component of critical geography, and I think it also should be a key component of architecture. These are questions we have to ask ourselves when we begin any project, a biennale, a piece of furniture, like understanding wood. You know, what is wood? What is the agency of wood? So again, so this is some of the work I've done with students, and we're trying to visualize mapping and cartography through, like, the question, the prompt is typically, it has to break, and I don't function with intuition. So this is a project we did a long time ago where we actually looked at the United States-Mexico border for like 2 years, and what we realized, the border is not a hard line, but it's a thick region that functions actually quite well, but it's this concept that is externally put on it, that is violent. And it's for an after reason. So that was a project in which we used cartography. This was like the reorganization of the Midwest to actually show its agricultural production and its toxic sites. By sort of moving away from a monocultural system of agriculture, we could actually develop a more holistic sort of approach. Because actually the number one terrorist threat in America is agriculture. It's not people that look like me. It's soil degradation. And no one cares about that. You've got these like hardcore people like no immigrants, and then like their fossil fuel companies destroying the physical definition of that country. And until we understand that that's a greater threat to a country's territory than, say, fundamentalists, like we're screwed. This is a project we looked at in Nebraska. So we're trying to pick these sites that were sort of banal to show complexity, but also show this misconception between inside and outside that the city kind of gradiates out. This is a project we did in Chicago, how infrastructure was used as sort of a racial construct to create segregation. So roads and streets were simply mechanisms for segregation. This was an exhibition I did 2 years ago in the Bioscope in Belgrade, where I was asked to look at the sort of the cultural and social relationship between Serbia and Switzerland. So we tried to sort of like use the map, but sort of critically looking at different scales, different urban contexts, et cetera, and came up with this sort of exhibition where we created this sort of interpretive sort of cartography between the two countries and showing it as a territory, but also we looked at the cultural and say economic exploitation of Serbia by Switzerland. So we extracted the portions of Serbia that were in Switzerland, right? So we called landscapes of extraction. And there was, again, so using this methodology, but also as a way, so it's nice to be in exhibitions or biennales because we address our work beyond academics. So my practice is domain, and I'm going to quickly show 3 projects in my office. I got 15 minutes left? All right. So domain's my office, and I started it a while ago, and it's completely unsuccessful, just to let you know. But I think we do okay work. So the first project is called Project Soul. We were hired by Dubai Properties. I don't know if you know them, but they're not okay. To develop this like new city, a smart city, et cetera, outside of Seoul. So luckily I did a project in Seoul with students at Delft in 2012 for this thing called Vertical City Asia. So we already had this sort of really incredible amount of research already. So it was interesting that we looked at Seoul with its rapid urbanization, people moving to the cities and the countryside, et cetera, but it also has an aging population, which is problematic, and it's only problematic because of the thing called the debt burden ratio. It's an economic index that determines what's the thickness of exploitable labor. So if you have people, like if you have too many elderly or too many children, it's bad for an economy. That's disgusting. So aging populations are only problematic because they can't be exploitable labor. You cannot extract labor or capital from them, nor can they shop. So this idea that, like, this term, and it's used, like, oh, you know, debt burden ratio, as it's like it's a pseudoscience. But also, with rapid urbanization, there's lots of problems. So suicide actually was like correlated with sort of personal income, right? But then education goes down. There's like plastic surgery quadrupled in Seoul. And also plastic surgery is another form of globalization. No one ever gets plastic surgery for an Indian nose, right? They get plastic surgery for Western Anglo-Saxon features. They want to look white. They want to have eyelids. They want to have a small, pointy nose. That's another form of globalization when you hate your own cultural identity. And that's what we're doing through architecture. By working for these people that come in there and just stamp shit, like, pfft, right? So again, Korea at this time has the most plastic surgery per capita than anywhere in the world. Because they have more money and they have more globalization and they're taught to hate, we're taught to hate ourselves. So again, this is rapid urbanization, and then we were looking at this project by Daniel Libeskind, and like, this is just not a good person, right? And of course, every corporate firm does a soulless project, and then the 2 nights before the presentation, they try to get some cultural relic and say, we use this as a reference, right? So this is the crown, and then, yeah, this is him, and then this is their project, which is nothing more than like a tribal tattoo plus Corbusier's vision, right? And this was the image they used. Sorry, I'll go back. I mean, look at the way it negotiates the ground, right? Look at the way it's touching the edges. That is wrong, and he won this competition, right? And they don't care because people are investing it from, like, you know, hedge funds, or the money's coming from oligarchs, or it's coming from Dubai. There are people that are financing these things don't give a damn about us, right? So this is this is every project that was proposed in Seoul over the next 5 or 6 years. So we're trying to make this polemic that we don't want to do that. So this is the site we were given. So this is this completely illogical, like, territorial definition, as if what happens here has no relation to here, right? And that's completely wrong. And so we're thinking about how we can reconceive a city in terms of its networks. And so you've got like the point city, and this is maybe like the Ronstadt, this sort of a polycentric configuration with these hubs. But we want to sort of reconsider the territory as linked and interconnected, and there's no hierarchy. There's no it's a sort of flat, continuous plane of connectedness. So this is the site. The client's like, do this. We want your vision. And I'm like, that's the worst thing anyone could ask for is my vision. One, because I'm not very good at that. Right? I'm not an artist. I can't like do a fucking bird sketch wings and say this is the project, right? But also it's just wrong. It's categorically, unobjectively wrong to ignore things. So we didn't do that. Instead, what we want to do is find like a material logic. And one thing we realized in Seoul, there's a lack of outdoor space. There's a high level of obesity because people aren't exercising. So we wanted to like sort of preserve like the landscape as much as we could, and also kind of create what we thought were the sort of material needs for that people at the time, which is sort of access to like public green space. So we began this by going to the site, and we started just mapping things. First, we realized there was this massive amount of architecture or space or urbanism, if you will, there that the client didn't care about. So we said, we're going to keep that. And we sort of marked, this is what's existing. We said, we have to keep this. And so by keeping that, we met 1.1 million square meters of their brief. Right? So we're going to keep the stuff, we're going to use it, we're going to integrate it. And we said, ideally, it would look like this. We would insert ourselves. We would be respectful visitors within the existing. We wouldn't colonize it. We wouldn't conquer it. We would respectfully try to inject ourselves. The next one was mapping everything that was existing, so the existing roads we kept. And then we mapped all the ecological sort of green spaces. And so we came up with this, map saying we can't do anything here. We're going to protect this. And then we took the negative of that and say this is where we can maybe potentially insert the project. So we'll insert ourselves within it. So that was sort of like the material logic within the site itself. And then we zoomed out and looked at its sort of relationship to a larger whole. And it could be a connected thing. So we started sort of thinking how this could sort of provide a network between the airport and Seoul. So introducing a tram line, creating these mini, clusters, kind of like the idea, but at a smaller micro scale. Creating these sort of like little towns within each sort of walkable distance, because most people don't want to walk more than 4.5 or 5 minutes. So how you create sort of walkability so you can access things without, driving or something. And then developing this sort of internal tram system, and then connecting to this really beautiful body of water that has a running track and all this stuff. So we're like, okay, we're going to integrate our logic within this sort of existing material logic. And then network systems, water tributary systems to make it sort of, to recycle water on the site for gray water, et cetera. And so we wanted the project to look like this, like you almost don't identify it as something new. Again, creating these things, and then we zoomed back out and we're like, okay, so what do we do here? And then we wanted to specifically address those things, that urbanization. Okay. So we wanted to deal with the elderly and the children, and especially people that have to take care of children. And so I'll go quickly here, developing walkability. We came up with this sort of ideal program mix, about each cluster kind of functioning in and of itself, but part of a larger whole. So each area has an identity, but it still each area provides the basic needs. So developing these very sort of like mathematical, sort of technical things, and then looking at each one as like an archipelago, each sort of cluster that we define through this material logic as its own little archipelago within this, productive network. And then we came up with this, and I'll go quicker, and then this is what we thought, this is just the grid networks, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we wanted the project to look like this. I don't know if I would still do this. This is like, when we were still trying to make money. Obviously, yeah, we didn't get the project. But we wanted to not to be recognizable, like this integration between the old and new, the existing, et cetera. So it was just also a way to test methodology. The next one is a really quick project I'll show you in Rome. So this is a collage of what we wanted it to look like. The next one is like this competition in Rome, and so it was just a quick thing we did in the office. It was for these forts, for a fort that was part of this larger ring of forts that was like made to sort of protect the city. But by the time the forts were built, the catapult was invented, so they became irrelevant like as soon as they were open. And of course, it was globalization. It was like some Dutch company coming there selling everyone forts that were completely irrelevant by the time they were finished. But they wanted to turn it into like a spa leisure center, like again another sort of thing. But we looked at Rome and how it's been financed, and like the foreign invaders of like global. FDI, foreign direct investments. We looked at the morphology of Rome and how it actually grows, and you realize there's this massive misconception of Rome is that only 2% of its sacred center is Rome. The rest of it, 95% of it or something, no one thinks of as Rome. Right? They preserved it as this sort of like UNESCO World Heritage Site, which was developed by the United States. UNESCO World Heritage was a construct of the United States that frees Europe. So we said, okay, this is like Rome. Like, there's like 95% of it is, that's a literal Rome. I'm saying anyone from Rome. I'm not saying you all look like this. But, there's this misconception, this perception versus reality of Rome. So what we proposed was for all these forts is to create this, because they're actually geographically a very sort of fortunate condition because they were between the rings of the old and the new. We said, okay, this could be something that serves as a conduit connecting them. We created this sort of like cinematic thing about driving around the ring and seeing our proposal on all the forts. And what we proposed, and this is our reconceptualizing of Rome as a territory, but we just wanted to put this reflective fabric over each one. So we did nothing. We said by putting this fabric over the thing, it sort of hides it, but also creates this sort of reflective. But it would have no program, and it would change every month. It would respond to anything that was happening. It would be a community center, it could be an art exhibition, but it had no definable program. But the tarp then became sort of this way of sort of like hiding it, but at the same time activating it. As you can imagine, we didn't win. So again, it was an idea of how do you sort of delegitimize this sort of inside-outside sort of condition, in a way, taking the mask off of Rome, and that Rome's so much more than its sacred heart. The last project I'll show is it was an open competition, but we were invited. It was in Thessaloniki, and I'll go quick here, but it was a typical sort of program, very similar. There's like these existing artifacts that we have to keep. They're very nice and very beautiful. The client essentially gave us this site, and we can do whatever we want except with existing. And so we found that problematic. It's a beautiful port, but also this site negotiates the part of Thessaloniki that burned and that then was rebuilt, like in this sort of Haussmann style in the 1920s. So it can negotiate between, say, its sort of traditional city and the modern city, which we thought was quite nice. So how can we activate that? Like these arches literally sort of as these thresholds between two sort of architectural sort of generations. So we zoomed out and we understood that Thessaloniki is a really critical port, agricultural port. Like a lot of the food we eat here is from Thessaloniki. It comes from its sort of territory. It's brought there and distributed. So we're like, okay, this site, because it's a port, because it's part of this, like geographically really well situated, it could maybe do something more. And so what we had proposed was to understand its sort of larger territory networks. This was sort of the plan, but then we examined it more and more, and McKinsey made this report for these investors from Dubai and Turkey, and it was just global capitalism again, hotels, spas, villas for like oligarchs. So we said we can't do this, and how can we challenge that? And this same client did this in Belgrade and said we're not going to do that. Like this is just, we're not doing that. So what we did is we found this report that was done by academics in the city and about how they want to create these green spaces throughout the city. Okay, and so we used that as it's sort of our concept, and we said, we're going to look at not the figure ground, but the green space, and see that as the built environment. We understood this green space, and we proposed an agricultural hub, where there's this artist that did this installation in front of the World Trade Center in the 80s, and we're like, it's surreal. And we're like, okay, this is beautiful. This is like what we want to do. So we thought about it as an agricultural production landscape, and we began collaging these things. So we came to this sort of idea, then using the artifacts as sort of cultural and social production and not simply consumption, and sort of doing these things and keeping the artifacts in different formal operations, dealing with preservation, et cetera, et cetera. And we proposed a food hub. We met their brief exactly, but we didn't really do it. And we created an architectural productive landscape that addressed this sort of thing. There was a tower that was a seed archive, so it preserved cultural production of its sort of agricultural heritage distribution. So it became an agricultural place. And it's still obviously we built something, but it was about sort of enabling this sort of more efficient sort of port economy with agricultural and preserving the heritage of its sort of agricultural, but also working with existing logic and the planners and the academics. And so this is what we proposed. It's a bit much, but yeah. They asked for their money back, but I didn't give it to them. So I'm going to conclude with this idea of the mask, right? So I hope I addressed it the best I could by delaminating the concept of urban and architecture and looking at it sort of with a bit more interrogation. And I want to end with this beautiful, beautiful passage by perhaps my favorite author, this James Baldwin, American author and just beautiful, brilliant human being. And he wrote this in The Fire, next time. Love takes off the mask that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace. Not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. So I think as a profession, we have to take off our masks and we have to understand, we have to love things. not use things and exploit things. And until we do that, we can't change our profession. And, okay, thank you.